Tonight, we uncover a vow so secret, its very words were never meant to be spoken aloud. A shadow oath whispered in hidden chambers, bound not by faith alone, but by absolute obedience. For centuries, the Jesuits have been praised as teachers, missionaries, and confessors, but behind the black robes lies a story far more unsettling. A rumour of a pledge so extreme it could turn loyalty into a weapon and silence into control. This is not just about religion or ritual. It is about secrecy, influence, and power that could reach from confessionals to thrones. Myths and fragments of this oath have appeared in forgotten pamphlets and forbidden books, each one hinting at a bond stronger than blood and more dangerous than any sword. Some call it a fabrication. Others insist it was real. But if the oath never existed, why does its echo still haunt us? And if it did, why has the Vatican guarded it with silence? So before you dismiss this as just another bedtime story, ask yourself, what promise could be so dark it must never be heard? Like the video, subscribe, because tonight we step into the oath, and some secrets were never meant to be revealed. In the heart of whispers that never make it to the pulpit lies a story so dark that even the Vatican would rather you never hear it. It begins not with scripture, not with the sound of church bells, but with a rumour. A rumour of an oath, a promise so absolute, so terrifying in its detail, that if spoken aloud, it would shake the faith of millions. The Jesuits, known officially as the Society of Jesus, were founded in the year 1540, a religious order devoted to education, missionary work, and total obedience to the Pope. But hidden beneath the polished sermons and scholarly robes, some say there is another vow, one that was never meant for the public to know. They call it the Dark Jesuit Oath. Imagine for a moment a pledge so binding that a man swears not only his life, but his soul. Not only to serve God, but to obey superiors with a loyalty that surpasses family, nation, and even conscience. Words said to be soaked in imagery of daggers and shadows, of silence and blood. Words that tell a brother he must become all things to all men, to infiltrate courts, schools, even confessionals, until no secret remains hidden. At first, it sounds like the plot of a thriller, something torn from the pages of a forbidden novel. But then you ask yourself, why has this oath been whispered about for centuries, surfacing in parliaments, in trials, in pamphlets? If it was nothing more than fiction, the Jesuits were feared as much as they were admired. Kings accused them of treachery, universities accused them of manipulation, and entire nations expelled them for reasons that were never fully explained. Again and again, the same question surfaced. Did they swear to something beyond the usual vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience? Something darker, something designed to turn each member into a perfect instrument of control. The Vatican has always denied it, of course. They dismiss it as propaganda, a fabrication invented by enemies. But silence often speaks louder than denial, and when archives remain locked and documents sealed, suspicion only grows. Think of it like this. If an oath is real, then the world has been living beside a brotherhood that answers to no king, no government, no law, but its own. If the oath is false, then why has it been repeated from the 16th century to the 21st without fading away? Perhaps the truth is not found in the words themselves, but in the power of secrecy. Because when people believe an oath exists, when they feel there is a vow no one is allowed to hear, that silence becomes its own weapon. The very idea plants fear, obedience, and mystery in equal measure. The story of the whispered oath is not about pages hidden in a book. It is about power that hides behind faith, about a church that may use secrecy not to protect souls, but to protect control. Tonight, we step into that shadow, into the echo of words that may have been spoken in dark chambers centuries ago. Was the dark Jesuit oath ever real, or has it been kept alive because someone needed you to believe it was? Either way, the moment you ask the question, you are already standing at the trapdoor of history, ready to fall into the unknown. When we talk about power, most people think of crowns, armies, or money. But the truest form of power has always been control over memory. If you can decide what people remember, you also decide what they forget. The Jesuits from the very beginning understood this better than anyone. They did not need to raise armies because their battlefield was not land but the human mind. Their weapons were not swords but schools, confessionals, and libraries. Imagine being a child in the year 1600 walking into a Jesuit classroom. The books placed before you are chosen by them, the lessons shaped by them, the way you see the world carefully built, like a stage set. From your first prayer to your first history lesson, everything is filtered through the same hand, and once that seed of knowledge is planted, it grows into the memory of a whole generation. The Jesuits became masters of education across Europe. Their colleges trained nobles, future rulers, priests, and even scientists. And while they were praised for their intellect and discipline, one must ask who was deciding the limits of knowledge, what stories were repeated, and what stories were erased. A history told through the lens of a single order becomes not history at all, but memory sculpted into obedience. The classroom became a throne room, invisible, but far more powerful than gold or steel. Confession was another key to this puzzle. To kneel before a Jesuit priest meant to reveal your most private thoughts, your fears, your sins, your ambitions. What was shared in the silence of confession could never be repeated out loud, yet patterns could be noticed, loyalties could be shaped, and influence quietly built. In this way, they gathered not only souls, but secrets. And secrets are the coin of power. A king may wear the crown, but if his conscience is guided by a Jesuit confessor, then the voice shaping the throne comes not from the palace, but from the church. Libraries, too, became part of this hidden structure. Books once scattered across Europe found themselves gathered under Jesuit watch. Texts were copied, translated, and in some cases, locked away. To the public, the libraries seemed like monuments of learning, but within those shelves lay a quieter truth. Knowledge that challenged doctrine was carefully sealed. Knowledge that reinforced obedience was spread wide. If you could control the shelves, you could control what future generations would even know existed. And so entire ideas could vanish, not through fire or destruction, but simply through silence. It is here we see the true meaning of gatekeepers of memory. They did not just tell the people what to believe, they told them what was worth remembering at all. And when you grow up in a world where every book, every lesson, every confession points in the same direction, you no longer ask questions because you do not even know what to ask. Memory becomes a prison built so gently that no one notices the walls. And from inside, that prison history itself can be rewritten not with ink or blood, but with silence. In the year 1541, a soldier turned mystic named Ignatius of Loyola gathered a small band of companions in Paris. They were men of learning and men of faith who pledged themselves to a new order within the Catholic Church. They called it the Society of Jesus, and their mission was to defend the faith, teach the young, and bring the gospel to lands far beyond Europe. At least that was the story written in public. On paper, their vows were clear: poverty, chastity, and obedience. But from the very beginning, whispers followed them. Whispers of a vow, unspoken in open halls, but sworn in hidden chambers. A vow that bound them not just to the Pope, but to something even darker. The Jesuits rose quickly in power because they were not like other monks or priests. They moved through the world with the discipline of soldiers and the cleverness of scholars. They could adapt to any culture, wear the robes of China, learn the languages of India, or sit quietly in the courts of Europe, advising kings. Their loyalty was praised as absolute, and yet that very word absolute stirred fear. What if their obedience was not only to God, but to secret commands hidden from the outside world? Some called it the fifth vow. This alleged vow spoke of complete surrender, not just in spirit, but in action. It was said to demand infiltration into governments, universities, and even rival churches. A Jesuit was to become whatever he needed to be: a priest, a scholar, a merchant, even a spy if required. The oath, as rumour painted it, was not about saving souls, but about building influence until no barrier remained between the order and the levers of power. The Vatican never confirmed such a vow, yet stories of it surfaced again and again in parliaments and pamphlets across Europe. Could so many accusations be pure invention, or was there a shadow truth buried beneath layers of denial? The Society of Jesus became known as an invisible brotherhood. Their faces were present everywhere, yet their true intentions remained hidden. They were expelled from countries, including France, Portugal, and Spain, accused of plotting behind the scenes. But each time, they returned stronger than before. If their only goal was to teach and preach, why were rulers so terrified of them? The answer may lie not in what they admitted publicly, but in what they refused to reveal. The birth of the Jesuits marked more than the founding of another religious order. It was the birth of a network that blurred the line between devotion and domination. Whether the fifth vow was ever formally spoken may never be known, but the effect was the same. The world saw a brotherhood that operated like no other one, that appeared holy, yet carried the aura of secrecy. And when a society builds its strength, not on what it shows, but on what it hides, the truth becomes harder to separate from the myth. What began in Paris in the year 1541 may have been a mission to serve God, but it quickly became a story of suspicion, power, and whispers that echo to this day. Obedience is a word that sounds simple on the surface. To obey is to follow orders without question. But within the Jesuit world, the word takes on a shape that bends and twists like light against a mirror. Outwardly, the Society of Jesus declared obedience to God, to the Pope, to their superiors. It was spoken with humility in sermons, written into official vows, and repeated in public ceremonies. Yet, behind the curtain, a deeper and more troubling question lingers. Who interprets obedience? Does it mean following the Pope exactly as he commands, or does it mean following the order's own vision of what God truly wants? When two voices conflict, whose voice becomes the law, here lies the power of doublespeak. To the faithful they could say, "We obey the Pope absolutely." To their brothers in secret, they could say, "We obey our mission first and interpret the Pope's words as needed." A mask for the world, a mirror for themselves. This technique allowed them to be trusted by rulers, confessors, and even enemies, while still advancing their own strategies. It was a kind of holy camouflage. They wore the appearance of loyal servants, but beneath the surface, they shaped the rules of the game. Throughout the 16th and 17th centuries, this duality became their signature. In classrooms, they taught children to respect the church. In courts, they guided kings with soft counsel. In missions, they appeared as humble priests, learning local languages and customs. Yet everywhere they went, accusations followed. Nations such as France and Portugal expelled them, not for preaching, but for meddling in politics. How could a group sworn to obedience be feared for disobedience? The answer may lie in how they defined the word itself. To them, obedience was not blind submission. It was strategic loyalty guided by a higher interpretation known only within the brotherhood. Even their spiritual practice reflected this mask and mirror system. The exercises of Ignatius trained them to examine every thought and feeling to find God's will. But that will was often interpreted through the lens of their order's mission. If they believed their task was to expand influence, protect the church, or counter enemies, then obedience could be stretched to justify nearly any action. A Jesuit could claim he was obeying the Pope, while in truth obeying his superior who had framed the Pope's command in a different light. To outsiders, it looked like perfect discipline. To insiders, it was perfect flexibility. This is why people feared them. An enemy who shows his weapon can be fought. An enemy who hides behind loyalty while shaping events unseen is far more dangerous. The Jesuits became known as both saints and schemers depending on who was speaking. Masks and mirrors, words with two meanings, orders with two directions. And at the centre of it all, one haunting question that still echoes. When obedience itself can be redefined, who truly commands the men who claim to serve all, yet answer to none? Every oath carries weight. But some oaths are crafted not only to bind words, but to bind souls. The rumour of the Jesuit oath has survived through centuries, because it reads less like a vow of faith and more like a blueprint of control. To understand its power, we must take it apart, piece by piece, as if it were a locked chest whose hinges are forged from secrecy. At its heart, the oath begins with pledges of loyalty. The member swears obedience to God, to the Pope, and to his superiors. This part seems no different from traditional vows spoken by other religious orders, but the rumour insists that the oath does not stop there. It stretches beyond the normal promises of poverty, chastity, and obedience. It moves into dangerous territory, where loyalty is demanded not only in belief, but in action, no matter the cost. The whispered text describes penalties so severe they sound more like curses than spiritual warnings. A brother who breaks the vow does not simply fall from grace. He is said to bring destruction upon himself and eternal damnation upon his soul. In some versions, even death at the hands of his own order is hinted at. This is the first sign of total loyalty. When the price of disobedience is painted in both worldly and eternal consequences, fear becomes as strong as faith. A man bound by such threats does not easily question orders. The oath also contains pledges that seem almost theatrical in their imagery. Promises to disguise oneself as anything required, a beggar, a merchant, even a rival priest. Promises to move silently in politics, to shape decisions without revealing the source. Promises to place the mission of the order above family, above friends, above nation. These words create an image of a man who no longer belongs to himself, but has become an instrument. His face may look familiar, but his actions are no longer his own. They belong to the will of the brotherhood. The structure of the oath reveals its intention. First, it seduces with sacred duty. Then it binds with terrifying penalties. Finally, it commands with pledges that erase individuality. Loyalty is no longer a choice, but the very air he breathes. And because the vow is said in secrecy, surrounded by others who have already sworn it, doubt becomes impossible. Who dares hesitate when surrounded by men ready to remind him of the punishments written into his soul? Whether the oath in its darkest form ever truly existed remains uncertain. But the anatomy of the rumour tells us something deeper. Even if imagined, it reflects what people feared the Jesuits to be. Not just scholars and preachers, but men who had given up more than ordinary vows could demand. Men shaped into shadows by words that cut deeper than swords. In the end, the question is not only whether the oath was real, but whether the loyalty of the Jesuits felt so absolute that the world could not explain it without imagining such a vow. In the grand halls of the Vatican, all eyes turned to the Pope, dressed in white, the visible shepherd of the faithful. Yet in the shadows, another figure has long been whispered about, a man not crowned, but commanding a different kind of authority. He is called the Black Pope, not because of skin or sin, but because of the black robes of his order and the shadowed role he plays. This figure is the superior general of the Jesuits, the highest leader of the Society of Jesus. Officially, his duty is to guide his brothers in prayer, teaching, and missionary work. But unofficially, the stories go much further, painting him as a hidden director, steering events across the world while remaining invisible to the public. The title alone carries a sense of dread. Why call him the Black Pope? The White Pope shines in light and ceremony. The Black Pope moves in silence and command. The contrast is not only symbolic, but strategic. To most Catholics, the Pope is the ultimate authority. Yet inside the order, every Jesuit swears absolute obedience to the superior general. His word is treated as if it comes directly from heaven itself. That means he can send a man across the ocean to China, another into the palaces of Europe, and another into the classrooms of Paris, all with a single order, no debate, no hesitation. This centralization of power has no equal in any other order. For centuries, rumors spread that the superior general held more power than the Pope himself. Kings accused him of manipulating politics. Scholars accused him of silencing inconvenient truths. Governments even expelled the Jesuits, claiming the Black Pope was pulling strings too deeply behind their affairs. Was this exaggeration, or was it the natural result of giving one man unquestioned control over the most disciplined order in the Church? The answer may lie in the way titles shape perception. To call him general rather than father emphasizes authority, not compassion. To call him the Black Pope suggests a rival throne hidden just out of sight. Myth and reality blur here. On paper, the superior general has no power outside his order, yet history shows otherwise. When Jesuit confessors guided kings, when Jesuit teachers shaped young princes, when Jesuit missionaries carried influence across continents, who truly held the stronger hand? The Pope gave blessings, but the Jesuits placed themselves in every corner of society, and at the center of this web stood one man directing the flow. The archetype of the Black Pope is more than a conspiracy. It is a recognition that sometimes power does not sit on the throne in plain view. Sometimes it resides in the man who gives the commands behind closed doors. Names may change with each generation, but the title remains and the fear it inspires continues. Myth, metaphor, or managerial reality. The idea of a director in the shadows forces us to ask whether history is guided more by the figures we see or by the ones we never notice. In the 16th century, the Catholic Church was under siege. Protestant reformers were tearing through Europe, spreading new ideas and new versions of faith. To fight back, the Jesuits built a weapon that was not made of steel but of schools. Their seminaries became training grounds where young men were shaped into precise instruments of loyalty and thought. These places were more than classrooms. They were switchboards of the mind, connecting every student to the same system of belief, so that when they left those walls, they carried not just knowledge but programming. A Jesuit seminary was strict. Students rose before dawn, prayed, studied, and repeated drills that fused discipline with devotion. Every subject, from Latin to logic, was taught with the same hidden aim: to build minds that could argue, debate, and persuade, yet never question the authority above them. Formation was the word used for this process, and it meant shaping the very character of a man until his will and the will of the order became one. By the time he finished training, he was not simply educated, he was standardized. His thoughts ran along tracks, carefully laid by centuries of Jesuit method. Confession played a silent role inside these walls. Every young Jesuit was expected to reveal his struggles, his doubts, his hidden thoughts. In return, he received guidance shaped by the order's traditions. But confession also worked like a map. It gave superiors insight into who was truly loyal, who wavered, and who might be molded further. In this way, private spiritual struggles became part of a collective network. The order did not only know what its members did, it knew how they thought and what they feared. With that knowledge, the formation became even stronger. The tool that gave Jesuits their sharpest edge was casuistry. This was the art of moral reasoning, breaking down complex questions into smaller steps so that almost any action could be justified if framed correctly. Casuistry was taught in seminaries as a skill, but it also became a lens through which future priests would interpret the world. A ruler could be convinced that a risky decision was moral. A student could be guided to believe that obedience was always the highest good. The reasoning was subtle, almost invisible, but once it took hold, it could bend situations in favor of the order's goals. When we think of seminaries, we often picture quiet halls filled with prayer. But Jesuit seminaries were more like communication hubs, each student a receiver of doctrine and a transmitter of influence once sent into the world. Whether they taught in schools, preached in villages, or advised kings, they carried with them the same training, the same methods, the same mental wiring. This is why the Jesuits spread so effectively across continents. They did not just send men, they sent replicas of a system, a network of minds trained to think alike, act alike, and above all, obey alike. The seminary was not simply a school, it was the hidden switchboard of an empire of thought. The world into which the Jesuits stepped was vast and divided by culture, language, and belief. To survive and thrive in such a landscape, they learned an art few others mastered. It was the art of holy disguise. Unlike rigid orders that clung to one way of preaching, the Jesuits could shift their appearance like chameleons. In China, they dressed like Confucian scholars and spoke of harmony and virtue rather than directly challenging tradition. In India, they studied Hindu customs and translated Christian ideas into local terms that felt familiar. In the jungles of South America, they blended with native rituals, presenting their teachings not as replacements, but as hidden fulfillments of ancient practices. To outsiders, it looked like compassion and adaptation. To critics, it looked like manipulation. This flexibility was not accidental. It became part of the order's very muscle memory. Jesuits were trained from the start to adapt to their surroundings. Language was not just communication, it was a mask. Dress was not just clothing, it was a tool. Doctrine itself could be bent in presentation, so long as the core mission remained untouched. The goal was always the same: spread influence and win loyalty. But the path could change 100 times, depending on who stood before them. Such tactics brought them praise and suspicion in equal measure. Many marveled at their ability to connect with cultures that had resisted every other missionary. Others accused them of deceit, saying they hid their true intentions under layers of borrowed tradition. In China, for example, debates raged over whether their acceptance of ancestral rituals was respect or compromise. The Vatican itself grew uneasy when the disguises became too convincing, fearing that Christianity might vanish into local customs. Yet, the Jesuits defended their approach as necessary for the greater good. If truth could not survive in silence, they argued it could survive in disguise. The more they practiced this art, the more natural it became. Generations of Jesuits were taught not to resist the change of masks, but to embrace it. In time, their adaptability became a defining feature of the order. People no longer knew if the man standing before them was truly a scholar, a priest, a merchant, or all three at once. This uncertainty became power. It allowed the Jesuits to move in places where open missionaries were banned, to enter courts, closed to foreigners, and to plant seeds of influence in lands that would otherwise reject them. The art of holy disguise was not about lies, it was about control. By becoming whatever the world expected them to be, they ensured their mission could never be stopped at the border of culture or language. It was not just a tactic, it was survival written into their very identity. And as history unfolded, this ability to shift shapes gave them an advantage no other order could claim. They were never fully seen because they were always changing. And in that constant change, the Jesuits learned the greatest secret of all. The surest way to remain hidden is to be everywhere and look like everyone. Step into a quiet church in the year 1600, and you will hear the faint sound of whispers behind wooden screens. A noble kneels, a merchant trembles, a queen closes her eyes. They are not speaking to a judge or a ruler, but to a priest, and what they reveal could shatter their lives if ever spoken aloud. This sacred space is confession, a place where sins are laid bare with the promise of forgiveness. But, in the hands of the Jesuits, confession became more than a sacrament. It became a quiet network of influence, a map of human weakness and power drawn in invisible ink. To confess meant to trust completely. Every thought of envy, every plan of betrayal, every private ambition was poured into the ears of a Jesuit priest. Bound by the seal of silence, he could never reveal these secrets publicly, yet patterns emerged. If a king confessed his doubts, the Jesuit confessor could gently shape his choices. If a noble confessed his ambitions, the Jesuit could counsel him in ways that aligned with the order's goals. Nothing needed to be forced. Advice offered in the name of God carried more weight than commands from soldiers. It was influence without violence, power disguised as guidance. The ethics of confession made it untouchable. No court could demand the secrets held inside those booths. No ruler could compel a priest to speak. Yet the Jesuit did not need to speak aloud. He only needed to use what he knew at the right moment. A warning here, a suggestion there, a small nudge that seemed like spiritual care but carried political consequence. In this way, the confessional became both a sanctuary for the sinner and a throne room for the advisor who heard every word. Across Europe, kings and queens trusted Jesuit confessors more than their own councils. To have the ear of a monarch in such an intimate way was a privilege no rival order could match. And, with each whispered secret, the Jesuits gained a clearer map of where power shifted, where loyalty faltered, and where pressure could be applied. Their network stretched beyond palaces. Merchants, generals, and scholars all stepped into confession, not realizing they were feeding a machine of influence. Critics accused the Jesuits of using confession as espionage, a cloak for gathering intelligence under the guise of absolution. The Jesuits defended themselves by pointing to the sanctity of the seal, claiming they never broke it. But what critics feared was not the breaking of silence. It was the shaping of silence into leverage. A confessor who knows every secret does not need to betray them. He only needs to guide the sinner toward choices already known to be useful. This is why confession became the quiet intelligence network of the Jesuits. It was never written down, never recorded, never exposed. Yet it existed as surely as any spy ring. In the stillness of those booths, lives and kingdoms were steered, and in that hushed exchange between guilt and forgiveness, the Jesuits discovered the greatest form of power. Not the power to punish, but the power to persuade. Obedience was the heartbeat of the Jesuit order, and Ignatius of Loyola made sure it was written into every fibre of their identity. He believed that to serve God fully, one must not only surrender possessions and desires, but even surrender the will. This meant that a Jesuit was to see his superior not as a man, but as the voice of God himself. Yet this demand for obedience raised a troubling question. What happens when conscience whispers one thing and command demands another? Which voice is followed when the soul and the order collide? The Jesuits trained for this conflict through a system known as discernment. Ignatius taught that by reflecting on emotions and choices, one could sense the will of God in all things. Joy was seen as a sign of divine approval, despair as a warning of error. On its own, this practice might have created free thinkers, guided by personal experience of faith. But within the structure of the order, discernment was reframed. Instead of leading to individual freedom, it became a method of aligning conscience with the commands of superiors. If doubt arose, a Jesuit was taught to question his own feelings rather than question the order. The language of obedience was sharpened into a script that allowed no escape. Jesuits were told to obey as if they were a lifeless body moved by the hand of another. They were to be like a staff placed in the hand of their superior, ready to be lifted or lowered at will. In this way, obedience was elevated beyond virtue. It became the very definition of holiness. A Jesuit could be brilliant, skilled, or brave, but without absolute obedience, he was nothing. With it, he became the perfect instrument. This level of surrender blurred the boundary between conscience and command. If a superior instructed something difficult or even troubling, the Jesuit was to silence his own hesitation and act as though the command came directly from heaven. Critics saw in this teaching the seed of danger. If men are trained to doubt their conscience in favour of obedience, what limits remain? Could loyalty to God be twisted into loyalty to strategy? Could a vow of faith become a tool for power? History shows that this radical obedience made the Jesuits feared and admired in equal measure. They could be sent into the most dangerous missions with certainty that they would not falter. They could stand in the courts of kings and speak with authority because their words carried the weight of an entire order behind them. But the cost was individuality. In exchange for unity, they surrendered the freedom to resist. The script of obedience turned men into voices of a single will. Whether that will was divine or human became almost impossible to tell. And so the question remains, when conscience and command collide, which wins? For the Jesuits, the answer was written long ago. Conscience bows, command speaks, and in that silence, obedience becomes the law. Imagine walking through long stone corridors deep beneath the heart of Rome, where shelves stretch further than the eye can see. There is no sunlight here, no open windows, only locked doors and strict guards. This is the image people hold when they hear of the Vatican's secret archives. And for the Jesuits, it was not only a symbol, but a method. To control history, you do not always have to burn books. Sometimes, you only need to hide them. The phrase library with no windows captures this idea perfectly. Knowledge is stored but never seen. Words are preserved but never spoken. And in that silence, truth becomes as unreachable as if it had been destroyed. The Jesuits quickly understood the power of such sealed collections. Across Europe, their colleges and seminaries gathered manuscripts from every corner of learning. Ancient philosophy, maps from explorers' works of science and theology, all found their way onto shelves behind closed doors. To the outside world, these libraries looked like treasures of knowledge. But access was tightly controlled. Only approved members could read. Only certain ideas were copied. And anything judged dangerous or heretical was locked away in private sections marked as forbidden. The library became less a garden of wisdom and more a gate where memory itself was filtered. Indices were another tool in this hidden system. Lists of banned or restricted books circulated quietly through the order. A student might never even know a certain text existed because it would never appear on the index of approved reading. Entire generations grew up without realizing that voices had been erased, not by fire but by omission. To them, history seemed seamless, yet it was a patchwork quilt sewn by careful censors. Critics asked why so many books needed to be hidden if the truth was strong enough to stand on its own. The Jesuits answered with the language of protection, claiming they were shielding the faithful from dangerous lies. But the deeper implication is that truth itself was being decided, not discovered. By controlling access to manuscripts, by sealing away archives, the order held the keys not only to the past, but to the very imagination of the future. A library with no windows is more than a room. It is a metaphor for how secrecy shapes entire civilizations. When a text is hidden long enough, it might as well have never existed. When only one group decides what may be read, the memory of humanity bends toward their design. Whether the Jesuits acted out of fear, faith, or strategy, the result was the same. The story of the world became their story to tell. And so behind those locked doors and endless shelves lies not just paper and ink, but the silence of centuries carefully kept away from the eyes of the world. In the world of secret societies and hidden orders, power is rarely shouted. It is whispered in symbols, written in margins, and tucked into mottos that sound ordinary to outsiders, but carry deep meaning to those within. The Jesuits became masters of this art of communication. Their loyalty was absolute, but it did not always need to be declared openly. Instead, it could be shown through words that looked harmless on the surface, or through signs that blended into everyday life. These code words, in plain sight, allowed them to speak to each other without being noticed, and to leave behind traces of identity hidden in the most ordinary places. One of the most recognizable symbols of the order is the monogram IHS, often surrounded by rays of the sun. To the faithful, it was explained as the holy name of Jesus. But within the Jesuit network, it became more than devotion. It was a mark of presence, a signal that their influence had reached a certain church, school, or palace. The same was true of mottos such as Ad Maiorem Dei Gloriam, which means, for the greater glory of God. To most, it was simply a pious phrase. To Jesuits, it was a constant reminder of their unique mission, one that justified almost any action as long as it served the order's higher purpose. Even in their books, the Jesuits left subtle traces. Marginal notes written by teachers could guide students to interpret texts in ways that outsiders would miss. A single phrase, a highlighted passage, a comment tucked in Latin, could shift meaning quietly. Over time, these layers of coded commentary built a tradition of double reading. One level was safe for the public, while another was reserved for those trained to see it. This way, knowledge could travel under the surface like a hidden current. Architecture also carried their hidden language. Certain designs in churches and schools repeated patterns that seemed decorative but were actually signals to the initiated. A compass here, a sunburst there, an eye carved into stone. Each one could be explained away as common Christian imagery, yet together they whispered a different story. The Jesuits did not need to hide their marks completely. They only needed to place them in sight where no one thought to question them. Critics accused them of creating a secret code to bind loyalty in ways outsiders could never break. Supporters said the symbols were nothing more than art and tradition, but the effect was clear. A Jesuit, moving across Europe or Asia, could walk into a chapel, see the familiar motto or emblem, and know he was among brothers. These ordinary signs became passports for trust-safe paths in dangerous times, and reminders that the order's presence stretched far beyond the visible. Code words in plain sight teach us a haunting lesson. What we think is ordinary may be extraordinary to someone who knows the key. A phrase carved into stone, a symbol painted on a page, a note written in the margin can carry more power than speeches or armies. And when those signs belong to an order sworn to secrecy, they remind us that sometimes the loudest voice is the one we never realize we heard. Power is often imagined as something held in castles or parliaments, but the Jesuits discovered a quieter throne. It was the classroom. From the 16th century onward, they built schools that stretched from the grandest colleges of Europe to the smallest villages in faraway lands. In these rooms filled with chalk dust and worn benches, they crowned themselves with an authority that no king could rival. They did not need to rule over armies when they could rule over minds. Their colleges attracted the sons of nobles and princes, eager to give their heirs the best education available. The Jesuits taught languages, philosophy, science, and theology with a rigor that impressed even their critics. A student leaving their halls was not only intelligent, he was also shaped to think within the lines the order had drawn. What seemed like education was also indoctrination, written with subtlety into textbooks and lectures. These books acted like time machines, carrying chosen versions of history and filtered knowledge into the next generation. Whatever was omitted was forgotten. Whatever was emphasized became memory itself. In village schools, the effect was just as powerful, though less noticed. Ordinary children learned to read and write, often for the first time under Jesuit instruction. The lessons taught them not only skills but obedience. The church was presented as the natural center of life. Authority was presented as divine. Curiosity that strayed beyond approved subjects was gently redirected back toward faith. In this way, peasants as well as princes were bound into the same mental framework. The Jesuits prided themselves on making their teaching engaging. They used plays, poetry, and debates to capture the minds of students. Yet behind the creativity lay strategy. A school play might seem innocent, but its themes would reinforce loyalty to the church. A debate might sharpen wit, but only within boundaries that never challenged core doctrine. Even subjects like science and mathematics were wrapped in language that ensured discovery would never stray too far from theology. This mixture of brilliance and restraint made Jesuit schools admired for their excellence and feared for their influence. By the 17th century, their network of schools spanned continents. A young man in Paris could learn under Jesuit masters in the same style as a student in Lima or Goa. This global uniformity created a generation of leaders who thought alike, spoke alike, and carried the same hidden loyalty. The classroom had become the order's crown. It gave them access to future rulers, future priests, future merchants, and scholars. To shape the child was to shape the man. To shape the man was to shape the world. The power of the Jesuits was not only in their whispered oaths or hidden libraries, but in their open schools, where everyone believed they were simply learning. In truth, they were stepping into a carefully constructed reality. And once you grow up inside that reality, you rarely question it. That is how a classroom became more powerful than any throne, and why the Jesuit crown was made not of gold, but of chalk and ink. In the courts of Europe during the 16th and 17th centuries, one figure often stood closer to a king than his generals or advisors. It was not a nobleman or a warrior, but a Jesuit confessor. Behind closed doors in candlelit chambers, monarchs revealed their doubts, their sins, and their ambitions to men trained not only in theology but in strategy. What began as spiritual guidance often slipped into political influence. The line between pulpit and parliament blurred, and in that space the Jesuits thrived. Consider France, where Jesuit confessors guided kings through wars and alliances. They did not command armies, but they shaped the consciences of those who did. A single word of counsel, framed as spiritual advice, could tilt decisions about treaties, taxation, or even war. In Spain, the pattern repeated. Jesuit advisors whispered into royal ears, shaping not only personal morality, but national policy. Their influence reached beyond the palace walls into Parliament, where laws and reforms reflected the silent hand of their council. Critics accused them of being puppeteers pulling the strings of nations under the disguise of saving souls. The pulpit gave them another stage. Preaching in cathedrals filled with nobles and commoners alike, they framed politics as moral battles. Wars were painted as divine missions. Obedience to rulers was linked with obedience to God. By shaping public opinion from the pulpit, they reinforced the same ideas they whispered in the ears of kings. It was a double strike, one aimed at the throne, the other at the people. Between court and cathedral, they created an echo chamber, where their vision of order seemed unquestionable. Not everyone accepted this quietly. Parliaments in places like England and the Netherlands grew suspicious. They accused the Jesuits of manipulating rulers into policies that served Rome rather than their own nations. Pamphlets circulated painting them as conspirators who sought to undermine governments from within. In some cases, these suspicions led to expulsions, as entire countries banned the order. Yet, even in exile, their influence lingered, because once a conscience is shaped, it continues to act even in the absence of the shaper. What made the Jesuit presence in courts so effective was their unique blend of spiritual and intellectual authority. A king might ignore the advice of a general or a minister, but to ignore the voice of his confessor felt like ignoring God himself. That weight gave the Jesuits access to the deepest chambers of power where policy was born. They did not need to shout or threaten. They only needed to whisper. Princes, parliaments, and pulpits formed the triangle of their influence. Each point strengthened the others until the Jesuits became not just religious teachers, but hidden architects of political destiny. Whether seen as saviors of faith or schemers of power, their presence in the halls of state proves one haunting truth. The most powerful voices in history are not always the loudest. Sometimes they are the quietest ones, speaking in shadows, where decisions are made and nations are steered. Casuists were Jesuit thinkers who became famous and infamous for their ability to slice moral problems into the thinnest of pieces. They used reasoning so sharp it was compared to a razor, a tool that could cut away guilt from even the heaviest actions. At first glance, this method was meant to help believers navigate difficult choices. Life in the 16th and 17th centuries was filled with conflicts between duty to faith and duty to survival. Casuistry promised answers when none seemed clear, but over time it became a weapon that critics claimed could justify almost anything. The idea was simple but dangerous. If a man faced a moral dilemma, the Jesuit casuist would break it down step by step into smaller questions. Each piece seemed harmless on its own. By the end of the reasoning, the man might discover that what once looked like sin could be excused under the right conditions. Stealing bread might not be theft if it saved a starving family. Lying might not be falsehood if it prevented greater harm. Even acts of violence could be reframed as unfortunate necessities if directed toward a higher goal. The razor could cut away sin until almost nothing remained. To ordinary people, this sounded merciful, but to rulers and rivals, it looked like manipulation. Critics accused the Jesuits of creating a system that allowed them to bend morality to fit strategy. If a political assassination could be justified with hair-fine reasoning, then what limit was left? If loyalty to the Pope outweighed loyalty to one's nation, could betrayal be excused as obedience? The razor of casuistry seemed to grow sharper with every generation until its edge threatened to slice truth itself apart. Inside their schools, students were trained in this method as if it were an art form. They debated endless cases with tiny distinctions, testing how far logic could stretch. It was not taught as corruption, but as skill, the ability to guide souls with precision in complex situations. Yet the effect was the same. The Jesuits became known as men who could find a way to excuse anything as long as it served the greater glory of God. The boundaries between conscience and convenience blurred until they almost disappeared. The controversy grew so intense that even within the church, voices rose against them. Famous thinkers mocked their subtle arguments as slippery tricks designed to hide ambition under the mask of piety. Books were written condemning their methods as dangerous to both morality and society, and yet the Jesuits defended themselves by saying life itself was complex and only their razor could cut through its tangled knots. The casuist's razor remains one of the most haunting symbols of Jesuit influence. It shows how reasoning meant to comfort the guilty can just as easily empower the powerful. A single distinction drawn on paper could ripple outward into decisions that shaped nations, and, when a tool sharp enough to justify anything falls into the hands of men trained to obey without question, the world begins to wonder. Did the Jesuits guide souls toward truth, or did they carve truth itself into whatever shape they required? The Jesuits have been called many things: saints, schemers, teachers, spies. But one of their most defining qualities has always been their ability to survive. Time and again, governments expelled them, rulers condemned them, and even popes suppressed them. Yet each time, they seem to return not weaker, but stronger. It is as if fire only hardened them and silence only sharpened their resolve. The story of their trials by fire and silence is not only about survival. It is about how institutions that vanish from sight can re-emerge with even greater influence. In the 18th century, their power reached such heights that kings and ministers across Europe began to fear them. They were accused of meddling in politics, manipulating confessions, and directing policy from the shadows. By the 1770s, the pressure boiled over. France, Spain, Portugal, and several other nations expelled the order, closing schools and seizing property. Finally, in 1773, Pope Clement XIV officially suppressed the Society of Jesus. To many it seemed like the end of the Jesuits, a final blow to an order that had stretched too far. But disappearance can be an illusion. The Jesuits never truly vanished. In Russia and Prussia, rulers who valued their skills refused to enforce the papal decree. Jesuit schools continued to function quietly in those regions, keeping the order alive. Meanwhile, former members blended into other institutions, carrying their methods and loyalty like embers waiting to reignite. For over 40 years, the Society of Jesus remained officially dead, yet its influence pulsed beneath the surface like a hidden current. When Pope Pius VII restored the order in 1814, the Jesuits returned almost instantly to prominence. Their schools reopened, their missions expanded, and their network of influence resumed as if it had never been interrupted. To critics, this was proof that suppression had been a failure. To supporters, it was a miracle. But the deeper lesson is that absence itself can become a form of power. By vanishing, the Jesuits gained an aura of mystery. By surviving suppression, they proved their resilience. People began to see them not as ordinary priests, but as a brotherhood that could not be destroyed. This cycle repeated across centuries. Each expulsion forced them to adapt, to grow more disciplined, more secretive, and more determined. Each restoration gave them renewed legitimacy. The fire of public attacks burned away weakness. The silence of suppression taught them patience. Together, these trials became part of their identity. They were not just men of the church. They were soldiers who could endure exile and return to the battlefield stronger than before. Trials by fire and silence reveal the paradox of the Jesuits. The harder the world tried to erase them, the deeper they carved themselves into history. Their survival was not an accident, it was strategy. And in the end, the question remains: if an institution can be destroyed again and again, yet still rise from the ashes, was it ever truly defeated at all? Or has it always been one step ahead, waiting for the moment to return? The story of Jesuit missions is less like a straight road and more like a twisting labyrinth filled with dazzling successes and bitter dead ends. From China to Japan to the Americas, their approach was marked by a unique strategy called accommodation. Instead of forcing their culture onto others, they adapted, wearing local clothes, learning local languages, and even blending Christian ideas with native customs. To some, this was empathy, a way of showing respect. To others, it was empire in disguise, a subtle invasion that conquered not with armies but with ideas. In China, men like Matteo Ricci, dressed as Confucian scholars, mastering classical texts and winning the respect of mandarins. They presented Christianity not as a foreign faith, but as a philosophy of harmony that could fit alongside ancient traditions. They even permitted ancestral rites, calling them cultural rather than religious. For a time, this approach opened doors no other missionaries could pass through. Jesuits walked the halls of emperors, built observatories, and translated both Eastern and Western knowledge. Yet this same flexibility caused tension. Other church authorities accused them of diluting Christianity. The Chinese rites controversy exploded, and eventually the Vatican condemned the practice, closing doors the Jesuits had worked for decades to unlock. In Japan, the labyrinth twisted differently. Jesuits first found favour with local lords eager for trade and new weapons. Thousands converted, villages embraced the new faith, and for a moment it seemed as if Japan might become a stronghold of Christianity. But suspicion grew. Foreign influence was seen as a threat to the shogunate, and the once flourishing mission was crushed by persecution. Converts were executed, missionaries hunted, and Christianity forced underground. The Jesuit method of adaptation could not save them here, and Japan became a closed door that would not open again for centuries. In the Americas, the story was even more complex. Jesuits set up reductions, settlements where native peoples were taught European farming, crafts, and religion. To some, these communities offered protection from slavery and violence. To others, they looked like cultural cages where entire traditions were replaced with European models. The Jesuits called it inculturation, shaping the message to fit local life. Critics called it control, an empire of the soul disguised as empathy. The line between compassion and conquest grew so thin that it often vanished completely. Everywhere they went, the Jesuits faced this same paradox. Were they respecting cultures by adapting to them, or were they quietly reshaping those cultures from within? Empires conquer land with soldiers, but the Jesuits conquered hearts with words and symbols. And once a culture embraced their schools and confessions, it was forever changed. The missionary labyrinth reveals both the brilliance and the danger of their method. They could walk through walls others could not, reach peoples others feared, and win trust others never earned. But each turn of the maze came with a cost. To some, they were friends. To others, they were infiltrators. And to history, they remain both, a brotherhood wandering the labyrinth between empathy and empire. Faith and money have always walked side by side, but in the hands of the Jesuits, the two became so closely linked that even critics could not tell where one ended and the other began. Their mission was to save souls, yet their survival depended on silver. From the 16th century onward, they built one of the most sophisticated networks of patronage estates and endowments the Church had ever seen. To the faithful, a donation looked like an act of piety. To the Jesuits, it was also a stone placed in a long line of dominoes, each one toppling into influence, wealth, and power. Nobles across Europe, eager to secure their salvation, donated estates, lands, and fortunes to the Society of Jesus. Some did so out of gratitude, others out of fear, and many out of the hope that their names would live on through the prayers of the order. The Jesuits accepted not just coins, but vineyards, mills, farms, and even entire villages. These holdings provided steady income that funded schools, missions, and printing presses. Each gift seemed small, but together they formed a treasury spread across nations and continents. The brilliance of the Jesuit system was in how they used these resources. Unlike other orders that hoarded wealth for luxury, the Jesuits reinvested. They built colleges that attracted the elite. They sponsored scholars who expanded their intellectual reach. They financed missions to distant lands, where influence could later return in the form of trade or alliances. Every coin multiplied its effect, not in gold alone, but in loyalty. A noble who gave a fortune also gave his trust, and his heirs often continued the bond. This patronage created invisible chains, linking the Jesuits to the most powerful families of Europe. A prince, educated in their schools, a merchant, funded by their loans, a widow comforted by their prayers, all became part of the same web. And in this web, the Jesuits held not only spiritual authority, but financial leverage. They could influence decisions at courts and in markets, not by issuing threats, but by controlling the flow of resources and memory. Of course, such power drew suspicion. Critics accused them of using donations as bribes for political influence. Pamphlets claimed they cared more for silver than souls. Yet the truth was subtler. For the Jesuits, money was never the goal. It was the fuel. Each estate, each gift, each endowment became another domino lined carefully on the board. When pushed in the right direction, the whole chain could move societies toward their mission. Banking souls and counting silver may sound like opposites, but in the Jesuit world they were one and the same. To secure eternity for the faithful, they secured resources in the present. And in doing so, they discovered a law as powerful as any sermon. Influence does not only rest on words whispered in confession or lessons taught in schools. It also rests on the coins dropped quietly into their hands, coins that echoed far louder than prayers. When the printing press spread across Europe in the 15th century, it promised to unleash knowledge for all. Ideas once locked in dusty libraries could suddenly be copied by the thousands. But as quickly as this river of ink began to flow, another force appeared to guide its current. The Jesuits stepped into the world of print not only as writers but as editors and censors. They understood that the question was never just who reads. It was who decides what gets read. From their earliest years, the Society of Jesus used the press as both sword and shield. They produced catechisms, prayer books, and theological treatises written with clarity that made them accessible even to the unlearned. In their colleges, they printed textbooks designed to standardize what generations of students would believe about history, science, and morality. But alongside creation came control. For every book they wrote, they also marked others for suppression. A red pen hovered over the page, ready to strike out words judged dangerous. The index of forbidden books became the quiet map of this control. Jesuits did not invent censorship, but they became some of its sharpest guardians. Entire works of philosophy, science, and even literature were listed as prohibited. The reasons ranged from heresy to immorality to the vague charge of leading minds astray. A reader might never know a book even existed because it vanished before it reached his hands. Knowledge was not burned in the square. It was silently redirected in the print shop. Even when they allowed a book to circulate, it was rarely untouched. Jesuit editors shaped translations and commentaries so that the meaning bent toward doctrine. A scientific work might be trimmed of troubling conclusions. A historical account might be reframed to highlight divine providence. Marginal notes and prefaces acted like invisible guides, telling readers how to think before they even began. The geometry of reading was carefully drawn. The reader might believe he was moving freely, but the path had been mapped long before. Critics saw in this control the hand of manipulation. They accused the Jesuits of using the printing press not to spread truth, but to build a cage of acceptable thought. Defenders claimed they were protecting souls from error. Both sides recognized one fact: whoever holds the pen holds the memory of mankind. The Jesuits did not need armies to conquer. They only needed presses to print their version of the world. The printing press promised freedom, but with the red pen it became another battlefield. And on this battlefield, the Jesuits proved masters. They knew that one edited sentence could shape generations more deeply than a sermon. A forbidden book could erase a question before it was even asked. In the quiet geometry of ink and margins, they discovered the simplest and most enduring form of power. To decide what words are read is to decide what worlds can exist. The so-called Jesuit oath has always hovered in the shadows like a ghost. No original manuscript has ever been displayed. No official declaration has ever confirmed it. Yet the whispers refuse to die. What we know of this oath does not come from a single book locked in a vault, but from fragments scattered across centuries. Testimonies of ex-Jesuits, pamphlets printed by their enemies, parliamentary records where politicians accused the order of sinister vows. Each piece is like a shard of glass, sharp but incomplete. When placed together, they reflect something unsettling, even if the full picture never appears. In 17th century, England pamphlets spread wild stories of Jesuits, swearing to disguise themselves as Protestants, to infiltrate courts, and to kill enemies of the Pope. Some of these accounts were exaggerated, written as weapons in the wars between Catholics and Protestants. But exaggeration does not always rise from nothing. They were believed because the Jesuits already carried a reputation for secrecy. In parliamentary debates, Jesuit influence was treated as fact, even when proof was thin. Their enemies spoke of an oath so dark it demanded loyalty above family, above nation, above conscience. Testimonies also surfaced from those who claimed to have once been inside. Some swore that in dimly lit rooms, novices were pressed to make vows that went far beyond poverty, chastity, and obedience. They spoke of pledges to pursue the order's mission by any means necessary. The penalty for betrayal was said to be death, whether by God's judgment or the Brotherhood's own hand. Historians still argue about whether these testimonies were genuine or manufactured by rival powers, but their persistence across borders and decades suggests that something fed the fire. The 18th century brought even more records. Parliaments in France, Portugal, and Spain compiled accusations against the Jesuits when expelling them. Among the charges were repeated references to secret vows and hidden instructions. None of these accusations produced an original oath, yet the echoes continued. Like a story told again and again in different voices, the details shifted, but the outline remained. Total loyalty, ruthless strategy, obedience that erased individuality. Critics argue that the Jesuit oath, as described in these sources, is a fabrication designed to demonize the order. Defenders point to the lack of concrete evidence, but the very absence of certainty is what keeps the story alive. Silence becomes part of the echo. If the Jesuits deny the oath, skeptics say denial is exactly what one would expect. If no manuscript is found, believers say that is proof of how well it was hidden. The oath survives not in parchment, but in accusation. An oath written in echoes teaches us how history can be shaped by fear and rumour as much as by fact. Each shard of testimony may be flawed, yet together they create a reflection too sharp to ignore. Whether myth or memory, the story of the Jesuit oath endures because it speaks to a deeper truth about secrecy and power. When silence leaves room for suspicion, even whispers can sound like thunder. When most people think of Jesuit power, they picture priests in black robes, debating kings, or teaching in elite colleges. Yet much of their influence flowed through channels far less visible. These were the fraternities, sodalities, and retreats organized for ordinary men and women, groups that seemed like devotional clubs, but in truth functioned as extensions of Jesuit authority. They were called many names in different lands, but together they formed something like night schools, quiet gatherings where lay people were shaped, guided, and sometimes mobilized for purposes beyond prayer. A sodality might begin as a circle of students meeting to pray under the guidance of a Jesuit teacher. Over time, it grew into a network of alumni, bound by loyalty not just to God, but to the order that had trained them. These circles often reached into courts, universities, and merchant guilds, carrying Jesuit influence into places where priests could not directly go. They provided a way for the order to touch politics and commerce without ever stepping onto the stage themselves. The priest remained in the shadows, while the lay auxiliary carried out the mission in daylight. Fraternities spread this reach further. They offered structure to communities, rituals of belonging, and the sense that one was part of a larger purpose. Members were taught to obey their Jesuit guides with the same seriousness as the priests obeyed their superiors. Through shared meetings, confessions, and spiritual exercises, these groups created a chain of loyalty that extended the order's grip well beyond its formal boundaries. It was influence multiplied without cost, a network that reproduced itself in every city where Jesuits settled. Retreats added yet another layer. These were intense spiritual workshops where laypeople withdrew for days of silence, prayer, and reflection under Jesuit direction. On the surface, they were about personal renewal, but the deeper result was alignment. Participants often left convinced not only of their faith, but of the Jesuit way of thinking, ready to return to their lives with a renewed sense of mission. A nobleman might leave a retreat more willing to fund a Jesuit school. A politician might emerge more sympathetic to Jesuit policies. A merchant might decide to endow a mission abroad. The retreat was less about isolation and more about quiet programming. The power of these night schools lay in their invisibility. They were not official institutions, like universities or monasteries, that could be closed by decree. They were voluntary groups that looked harmless, even charitable. Yet they spread across Europe and the colonies like threads of a net, binding together the lay and clerical worlds. A man who joined a sodality might one day guide a parliament. A woman who attended a retreat might shape the education of her children for generations. Through them, the Jesuits extended their reach without drawing suspicion. The night schools show us how influence does not always wear a crown or carry a title. Sometimes it sits quietly in the back rooms of churches, whispered in prayers and written in meeting notes. Yet, from those quiet gatherings, entire nations could be swayed, not by force, but by the steady hand of loyalty trained in the shadows. In an age when most people could not read, stories were not confined to books. They lived in the air, carried by preachers, painted on church walls, and staged in grand displays meant to stir awe. The Jesuits mastered this craft, and turned it into something more than devotion. It became the theatre of miracles, a stage where faith and politics merged, and where wonder itself became a tool of power. In their hands, belief was not only private trust in God, it was a public utility, a force that could be directed to shape communities and even nations. Hagiography, the writing of saints' lives, was central to this theatre. Jesuit authors filled pages with tales of holy men and women who endured suffering, performed wonders, and triumphed over evil through sheer faith. These stories were read aloud in schools and villages, often accompanied by illustrations so vivid that even the illiterate could imagine them. Every miracle attributed to a saint reinforced the idea that the Church, and by extension the Jesuits, stood closest to the divine. The line between truth and embellishment was blurred, but the effect was undeniable. People who heard such tales felt they had touched the supernatural. Beyond books and sermons came spectacle. Jesuit churches staged elaborate plays, complete with costumes, music, and stage effects designed to dazzle audiences. Angels descended on ropes, thunder echoed through hidden drums, and painted backdrops opened into visions of heaven or hell. These performances were more than entertainment. They were sermons written in light and sound, audiences left convinced not by argument but by emotion. The miraculous was not something distant. It unfolded before their eyes in a carefully crafted show. The politics of wonder grew clear in times of crisis. When plagues or wars shook a city, Jesuits promoted stories of miraculous healings or divine interventions linked to their prayers or relics. Processions carried sacred images through the streets, as people believed they were shields against disaster. Every successful display reinforced the Jesuits' position as mediators between heaven and earth. To rulers, these spectacles were useful. A populace filled with awe was easier to guide than a populace filled with doubt. And so miracles became not only articles of faith but instruments of governance. Critics accused the Jesuits of exploiting superstition. They claimed the order blurred the boundary between genuine devotion and staged illusion. Yet the Jesuits defended their methods as necessary for reaching the masses. If a miracle could move hearts toward God, why not let it shine in the streets? In their view, wonder was a ladder, and if people climbed it for spectacle, they might still reach salvation. The theatre of miracles teaches us that power often works through imagination. A story told at the right time can turn fear into obedience. A spectacle staged in the right place can make belief seem undeniable. For the Jesuits, miracles were never just heavenly signs. They were scripts, stages, and performances woven into the fabric of society. And in that theatre, the audience never left unchanged. Time seems like the most natural thing in the world, the steady rise of the sun and the fading of night. Yet history shows us that time can be shaped, measured, and even controlled. The Jesuits understood this better than most. To them, calendars and clocks were not just tools for keeping order, they were instruments for disciplining minds. If you can set the rhythm of someone's day, you can guide their thoughts. If you can decide when a community feasts, fasts, or prays, you can quietly mold the entire structure of their lives. In Jesuit schools, time was carved into strict blocks. Students rose at set hours, studied at precise intervals, prayed at regular points throughout the day. The discipline of the clock was as important as the lessons themselves. By repeating this rhythm over years, young men learned not only Latin and philosophy, but obedience to order itself. Time was no longer a neutral flow. It was a ladder they climbed step by step, always guided by Jesuit hands. Calendars extended this discipline beyond the classroom. Feasts of saints, days of fasting, seasons of penance, and cycles of prayer filled the year with constant reminders of the sacred. Each holy day acted as both a marker and a leash. The faithful did not simply live through time, they lived inside a schedule written by the Church and guarded by the Jesuits. Markets paused for holy days, rulers consulted feast calendars before signing treaties, and even farmers planted and harvested with one eye on the religious timetable. By shaping the calendar, the Jesuits shaped the rhythm of society itself. This control grew even sharper with their role in the reform of the calendar in 1582, when Pope Gregory XIII introduced the Gregorian system still in use today. Jesuit astronomers and mathematicians provided the calculations that made the reform possible. To the world, it was science in service of accuracy. To critics, it was proof that the Jesuits had inserted themselves into the very measurement of time. They were no longer just teachers of history. They were keepers of the clock by which history was written. The power of this system lay in its subtlety. People did not feel forced into obedience. They simply followed the days as they were given, yet over time, their sense of what was natural became what the Jesuits had designed. The rhythm of prayer before meals, the pause of work on feast days, the silence of fasting, all these became habits that shaped conscience and culture. When discipline is tied to time itself, resistance feels almost impossible. To fight it would be to fight the very hours of the day. Calendars and clocks remind us that control does not always come through laws or armies. Sometimes it arrives through schedules, whispered by bells, marked in red ink on holy days. The Jesuits mastered this art, turning time into a classroom, a pulpit, and a cage all at once. And in doing so, they showed how the discipline of days can become the discipline of minds. Secrecy is not only written in words or hidden in codes. It can be built into walls and woven into the very layout of buildings. The Jesuits understood that space itself could choreograph obedience, guiding movement, restricting sight, and shaping behavior without a single command being spoken. Their world was filled with safe houses, college cloisters, and embassy chapels that served not only as physical shelters, but as instruments of control. Geography became an ally in their mission, a map drawn not on paper but in stone and silence. In countries where Catholicism was outlawed, the Jesuits built safe houses disguised as ordinary homes. Behind plain doors lay secret passageways and hidden rooms where Mass could be celebrated and confessions heard. Trapdoors led to cellars, false walls opened into chambers, and attics were fitted with altars small enough to vanish in moments. These houses were not simply shelters, they were schools of obedience. To enter one was to step into a world where trust had to be absolute and loyalty unquestioned. Silence was survival, and secrecy became second nature. College cloisters formed another kind of geography. Their design shaped the lives of students through architecture as much as curriculum. Corridors forced orderly movement. Chapels stood at the center of courtyards, and dormitories were arranged to enforce constant supervision. Every step a student took reinforced discipline. The walls themselves seemed to whisper that one was part of a greater body, guided by unseen authority. In such spaces, obedience did not need to be argued. It was lived daily in the rhythm of locked gates, scheduled bells, and watchful eyes. Embassy chapels offered yet another layer of this hidden geography. In Protestant nations, where Catholic worship was banned, Jesuits used the diplomatic immunity of embassies to maintain secret centers of faith. A chapel tucked inside a Spanish or French embassy became a sanctuary where nobles and spies could gather under the cloak of legality. These chapels blurred the line between religion and politics, becoming both places of worship and hubs of information. The architecture of diplomacy was turned into a map of secrecy, where alliances were formed in whispers beneath the sound of prayers. What unites all these spaces is the way they choreographed obedience. To move through them was to follow a script without realizing it. The hidden door required silence, the cloister demanded discipline, the embassy chapel insisted on discretion. In each case, geography itself became the teacher. Walls and corridors trained the body as surely as sermons trained the soul. The geography of secrecy reminds us that power is not only in words or laws, but in the places we inhabit. A room with no windows can keep knowledge locked away. A corridor lined with doors can dictate how we move and think. The Jesuits knew this well. By designing spaces that demanded loyalty, they ensured that obedience was not only a vow, but a habit carved into daily life. And in those hidden houses and silent cloisters, the map of secrecy stretched further than any empire ever drawn on parchment. The Jesuits were known for their black robes, but their real battlefield was often fought on white pages. From the 16th century onward, they became not only teachers and confessors, but authors of vast literary campaigns. They understood that a person's reputation could be as powerful as an army, and that books could wound or glorify as effectively as swords. So they filled libraries and pamphlet stalls with works that praised their allies, defended their saints, and destroyed their enemies. Every page became a weapon sharpened with ink. Biographies of saints were among their most potent tools. Jesuit writers crafted lives filled with miracles, sacrifice, and divine approval. These works were not only religious inspiration, but public propaganda. A saint linked to the Jesuits became a symbol of their authority, proof that God had chosen them as his special instruments. Every miracle recorded, every martyrdom described, reinforced the image of the order as holy and heroic. Ordinary believers read these stories and felt awe, while rulers saw in them a claim to moral legitimacy that was hard to contest. At the same time, they wielded the pen like a dagger against opponents. Biographies of enemies painted them as heretics, traitors, or fools. A rival thinker could find his ideas mocked in carefully crafted pamphlets. A political enemy might be described as morally corrupt or spiritually blind. These texts did not simply argue. They attacked the very memory of their targets, ensuring that history would remember them through Jesuit words. To lose a battle in reputation often meant losing it forever. The Jesuits also mastered the art of responding to criticism through print. When accused of manipulation or ambition, they replied with polished essays and letters that defended their integrity. Their skill in rhetoric allowed them to twist accusations into proof of their own righteousness. If the world hated them, they said, it was only because they stood closest to the truth. In this way, even slander was turned into fuel for their legend. Pamphlets became their quick-strike weapons. Cheap to produce and easy to distribute, they flooded cities during times of conflict. In wars of religion, they spread pamphlets to rally crowds and sway opinion. In political disputes, they used them to tilt the debate in their favour. The streets of Europe often echoed not with muskets but with the rustle of paper, as readers passed along the latest tract penned by Jesuit hands. Black robes, white pages reveal a paradox. The Jesuits often spoke of humility and obedience, yet their writings show ambition and combativeness. They fought not only for souls but for stories, not only for faith but for memory. Their greatest victories were not always on battlefields but in libraries where their books outlasted their critics. In the end, they proved a haunting truth. To shape how someone is remembered is to shape history itself. And in that war of memory, the Jesuits wielded the pen like a sword and left marks that time itself could not erase. The confessional is one of the most sacred spaces in the Catholic world. A penitent kneels in shadow, whispers sins, and believes that whatever is spoken will remain locked in silence forever. The priest behind the screen is bound by what is called the seal of confession, a vow that nothing heard can ever be revealed. For ordinary people, this offers comfort, the chance to unburden guilt without fear. But when the confessor is a Jesuit and the penitent is a king, a minister, or a general, the seal becomes more than spiritual duty. It becomes a dilemma where silence itself can shape the destiny of nations. Imagine a monarch confessing his plan to betray an ally or to execute a rival. The Jesuit confessor cannot reveal it, for to do so would violate sacred law. Yet silence leaves the plan untouched. By omission, the priest allows history to unfold as if he had given permission. In some cases, the confessor might urge repentance, nudge the ruler toward mercy, or remind him of divine justice. But persuasion is soft and uncertain. The true power lies in what is not said, the knowledge locked in the priest's mind, unshareable even when it could save lives. This tension between the seal of confession and the reason of state became infamous in the 16th and 17th centuries. Political enemies accused Jesuits of using the confessional as an intelligence network, claiming they gathered secrets and passed them on indirectly. Jesuits denied this, insisting their silence was absolute. Yet the suspicion remained because even perfect silence can shape behavior. A ruler who knows his confessor will never betray him feels emboldened to speak freely. That very trust can alter his choices, making the confessional less a neutral space and more a hidden chamber of influence. For the Jesuits themselves, the dilemma was more than theoretical. Their rules demanded obedience both to God and to their superiors. What if a confession revealed a plot against the Pope? What if it threatened the survival of the order itself? The seal required absolute silence, but loyalty to the Church seemed to demand action. The Jesuit solution was often to act not by revealing, but by redirecting. A confessor might encourage the penitent to change course, to seek forgiveness through action, to undo the harm with his own hands. Silence was maintained, yet outcomes were subtly influenced. Critics argued this gave Jesuits immense invisible power. They could never be accused of direct betrayal, yet they could guide rulers under the cloak of secrecy. If a king repented of war after confession, who truly changed history, the monarch or the priest? If he persisted, who bore the guilt, the sinner who acted, or the confessor who stayed silent? The confessor's dilemma shows the haunting power of omission. Sometimes silence is not absence but presence, an action more potent than speech. In the hands of the Jesuits, the confessional became more than a spiritual box. It was a crossroads where secrecy, loyalty, and politics collided, and where silence itself could shape the fate of kingdoms. The alleged Jesuit oath has drifted through history like a storm cloud, never fully seen, yet always feared. Its supposed text has been copied in pamphlets, recited in parliaments, and whispered in secret societies. Scholars argue about its authenticity, but its words have been repeated enough to leave a scar on memory. To hear it is to step into a world where loyalty is demanded with blood and betrayal is punished with death. Whether real or fabricated, the clauses attributed to this oath reveal not only what enemies believed about the Jesuits, but what terrified them most. The rumoured text begins with a pledge of absolute obedience, not only to God or the Pope, but to the superior general of the Society of Jesus. This obedience is said to surpass all ties of family, country, or conscience. The aim is clear. The individual disappears into the order. His life becomes a tool, his will a blade directed by another hand. Such language reflects the fear that Jesuits were more like soldiers than priests, bound by discipline that erased personal choice. Next come the threats. The alleged oath describes punishments so violent they sound like scenes from nightmares. Betrayal, it warns, would be answered by torture, by death, by eternal damnation. Whether these details were invented by enemies or not, they serve to paint the Jesuits as men who lived under constant terror, loyal not only by devotion but by fear. Critics pointed to these lines as proof that the order's strength lay in coercion, not faith. Supporters dismissed them as slander designed to shock, but the images lingered, feeding the legend of ruthless secrecy. The text also includes promises of deception. According to the rumours, a Jesuit could disguise himself as a Protestant, a Jew, or even an atheist if the mission demanded it. He could adopt the language, the dress, and even the prayers of another faith so long as his heart remained loyal to Rome. To some, this was proof of dangerous duplicity, a brotherhood willing to betray any oath so long as it served the hidden one. To others, it was simply a dramatic exaggeration of the Jesuits' well-known adaptability. Either way, The effect was the same. The oath became a symbol of chameleon loyalty, men without fixed faces, bound only to a superior's command. Incentives also appear in the rumoured text. It promises honour, spiritual reward, and the satisfaction of serving the greatest mission on earth, the defence of the Church. These promises, wrapped in the language of eternal salvation, were designed to make obedience not only duty but privilege. Critics saw this as proof of manipulation, the forging of men who believed any act, however dark, could be sanctified by purpose. The oath's alleged text may never be proven authentic, yet its power does not rest on parchment. It rests on imagination. By dramatizing obedience, threats, deception, and reward, it captures the essence of what people feared most about the Jesuits. That behind their black robes lay a vow stronger than love, deeper than law, and more dangerous than any sword. Every legend casts a shadow, and the story of the Jesuit oath is no exception. If we listen closely to the trail of documents that mention it, another picture begins to emerge. One marked not by secret vows whispered in candlelight, but by ink stains left by political enemies. The alleged text of the oath did not appear in the 16th century when the Society of Jesus was first founded. It surfaced much later, in an age when propaganda had become a weapon as sharp as any sword. To trace its fingerprints is to uncover the work of forgers, polemicists, and pamphleteers who may have shaped the very words that terrified generations. In the 19th century, Europe was a furnace of conflict between Catholic and Protestant powers, monarchies and republics, revolutionaries and conservatives. In this climate, accusations against the Jesuits became a common coin of political warfare. Pamphlets denouncing them spread through parliaments and newspapers. Among these tracts, the so-called extreme oath began to appear, its lurid descriptions of murder and deception designed to shock readers into outrage. It was not discovered in a hidden archive, but printed in books that openly attacked the order. That origin alone raises suspicion. Historians who examined the language of the oath noted oddities. Some phrases matched the style of Protestant polemicists rather than the formal Latin used in Jesuit documents. Other parts echoed common themes of black propaganda in the 18th and 19th centuries, where enemies of Catholicism often portrayed priests as conspirators loyal only to Rome. The fingerprints of fabrication are visible in the very structure of the text. It reads less like a solemn vow and more like a theatrical script designed to horrify. Parliamentary debates in England during the early 1800s amplified the document's reach. Politicians hostile to Catholic emancipation cited the oath as proof that Jesuits could never be loyal citizens. Copies were entered into records, giving the illusion of official validation. Yet these copies were often traced back not to archives in Rome, but to anti-Catholic tracts circulated in London and Edinburgh. What began as propaganda became accepted as evidence simply through repetition. The Jesuits themselves consistently denied the existence of such an oath. Their defenders argued that the accusations were slander meant to justify expulsions and discrimination. Even some Protestant scholars admitted the text bore the marks of fabrication, noting that no credible witness had ever produced an original copy from within the order. Still, the rumour persisted because it served too many interests. For politicians, it justified laws. For rival churches, it fueled distrust. For the public, it confirmed fears of shadowy priests plotting in secret. The forger's fingerprints remind us that myths survive not because they are true, but because they are useful. The Jesuit oath, whether real or invented, became a mirror reflecting the anxieties of an age when religion and politics were inseparable. And in that mirror, enemies saw what they wanted to see, a brotherhood so ruthless it would swear to anything. To expose the forgery does not erase the legend, for legends rarely need truth to endure. All they need is fear, repetition, and ink. A forged document can be dismissed as false, but its effects can be more real than any signed parchment. The alleged Jesuit oath, even if written by enemies and never sworn by a single member of the order, still shaped how millions of people thought about them. Myths do not need truth to function. They work like an operating system running quietly in the background, guiding reactions, shaping laws, and defining trust. Once planted, such myths can govern the imagination of entire societies more effectively than facts. Consider the way the oath was used in politics. In 19th century, England opponents of Catholic emancipation waved the text as proof that Jesuits were dangerous infiltrators. It did not matter that historians questioned its authenticity. What mattered was that parliamentarians could point to it, recite its violent lines, and sway public fear. Laws were delayed, prejudice was stoked, and suspicion hardened. The forged oath functioned like a real one because it delivered results. It turned rumour into policy. The same effect appeared in everyday life. A Protestant family might whisper that Jesuits would disguise themselves as neighbours to destroy them from within. A merchant might refuse to trade with a Catholic out of fear he was secretly bound to a murderous vow. Suspicion spread through villages and cities, carried not by evidence but by belief. The forged oath acted as a script people followed, without realizing it, shaping behavior as if it were a command written in stone. For the Jesuits themselves, the myth became a trap. Denying the oath did little, for silence was taken as proof of guilt, and protest was dismissed as clever deception. The more they insisted no such vow existed, the more some were convinced that denial was part of the conspiracy. In this way, the myth operated like a closed circle. It could not be disproved, because disbelief was itself treated as evidence. That is the strength of a weaponized truth, not that it is accurate, but that it is unfalsifiable. The legend of the oath also influenced culture beyond politics. Novels, plays, and newspapers echoed its themes, portraying Jesuits as shadowy manipulators who swore loyalty only to their general. These stories trained the public imagination until the idea of a Jesuit without a hidden agenda became unthinkable. Once myth becomes entertainment, it no longer needs history to survive. It reproduces itself in stories, carried forward like folklore until generations grow up believing it instinctively. Truth weaponized does not have to be truth at all. It only has to be repeated until it feels undeniable. The forged oath worked because it crystallized every suspicion people already carried about the Jesuits: secrecy, obedience, duplicity, ambition. Whether or not they swore such words became irrelevant. The world believed they could, and that belief shaped history as surely as if the oath had been carved in stone. In the end, the real power of the text lay not in parchment but in perception. Myths, once weaponized, are almost impossible to disarm. The classroom has always been more than a place for learning. It is also a battlefield where ideas are tested, habits are formed, and minds are trained to see the world in a certain way. Centuries ago, the Jesuits turned schools into powerful tools of influence, weaving discipline, loyalty, and controlled knowledge into the daily rhythm of their students. Today, we might imagine that modern education has broken free from such strategies. Yet, when we look closely, we see echoes of those old methods still at work in pedagogy, psychology, and media studies. The classroom strikes back not with chalk and robes, but with algorithms, tests, and screens. Modern pedagogy often emphasizes structure and repetition, ideas the Jesuits themselves once perfected. Lesson plans broken into clear stages, schedules that demand precision, and examinations that measure not just knowledge but conformity to expected answers all echo the older model of formation. The aim is not only to inform but to shape the way a student thinks, to make reasoning follow certain grooves. What was once done with Latin and catechism is now done with standardized tests and scientific rubrics. The tools have changed, but the underlying principle remains. Control the structure of learning, and you control the structure of thought. Psychology deepens this echo. In the 20th century, schools began applying theories of behaviorism and conditioning, rewarding desired behaviors and punishing unwanted ones. The Jesuits had practiced a similar form of shaping, through confession, retreat, and discipline. Now, the methods are more clinical, dressed in the language of science, but the effect is familiar. Students learn not only what to know, but how to respond, how to fit into systems that measure and rank them. Silence in class may no longer be called obedience to God, but it is still trained as a virtue that makes institutions run smoothly. Media studies provide perhaps the clearest continuation. The Jesuits once mastered the printing press, filling libraries with approved works while censoring others. Today, the classroom integrates television, film, and digital platforms, teaching students to analyze media, but also subtly guiding them toward acceptable interpretations. The red pen has been replaced by algorithms that filter what is seen and unseen. Just as a 17th century student grew up reading only the texts permitted by his teachers, a modern teenager scrolls through feeds curated by invisible hands. The stage has shifted, but the lesson is the same. What you see shapes what you believe, and someone else decides what you see. The classroom of today may not look like a Jesuit cloister, yet the resemblance is undeniable. Structure, discipline, repetition, and narrative control still lie at its core. Teachers may not wear black robes, but the classroom remains a place where power works silently through schedules, stories, and systems. The question is not whether the old methods survived, but how they evolved. The classroom strikes back by showing us that the past never really leaves. It simply adapts, teaching each generation in ways that feel new but carry echoes of lessons written centuries ago. Once upon a time, the pulpit was the loudest voice in a community. Each Sunday, priests shaped what their people thought was true, what they feared, and what they hoped for. Words spoken from that raised platform decided the rhythm of weeks and the direction of lives. But in our century, the pulpit has been replaced by platforms, glowing screens that feed us stories, news, and opinions every hour of every day. What the sermon once achieved with scripture, the algorithm now accomplishes with code. Both claim neutrality. Both insist they only present what is already there, yet both act as powerful filters of truth. Think of confession. For centuries, men and women whispered their deepest secrets to priests, trusting that what they said would remain hidden, yet also shape the advice they received. Today, millions pour their habits, preferences, and private desires into the endless forms of data they leave online. Every search query, every video watched, every like tapped is a digital confession. And just like the confessor of old, the algorithm listens in silence, taking notes, and deciding what comes next. Instead of penance, it offers recommendations. Instead of absolution, it gives suggestions for what you should read, watch, or buy. The similarity runs deeper. The Jesuits once trained confessors to guide consciences subtly, to push a ruler toward mercy or a student toward discipline without ever seeming to command. Algorithms do the same by adjusting what content rises to the top of your feed. You believe you are choosing freely, yet your options have already been shaped. The invisible hand of code becomes a spiritual director of attention, bending not your soul, but your scrolling. The altar is no longer made of stone, it is made of pixels. This shift from pulpit to platform has consequences as profound as those faced in the 17th century when sermons defined politics. Public opinion now forms not in town squares but in comment sections. Outrage spreads faster than prayer once did, and silence can bury a story as effectively as censorship. Just as the Jesuits learned to control memory through the red pen and the library, tech companies now curate memory through algorithms that decide which histories trend and which vanish into obscurity. Both systems remind us of a hard truth. What you do not see might as well not exist. Critics of the Jesuits once accused them of disguising power as guidance, of pretending neutrality while shaping thought. The same accusation is now leveled at algorithms. They promise objectivity, yet they carry the biases of those who built them. They reward engagement, even if it spreads division, just as confessors once rewarded obedience, even if it stifled independence. The algorithm and the altar may seem worlds apart, yet they share the same hidden function. They curate reality, one in the name of salvation, the other in the name of convenience. The question for us is the same as it was for those who once filled the pews. How much of what we believe is truly ours, and how much is simply the echo of what has been chosen for us? The pulpit trained souls through sermons. The platform trains minds through feeds. And whether it is an altar or an algorithm, the power lies not in what is spoken, but in what is withheld. Centuries ago, the Catholic Church maintained a list called the Index of Forbidden Books. Titles judged dangerous to faith or morals were banned, sometimes burned, and their authors branded as heretics. To read outside the approved canon was to risk both your soul and your reputation. The index was officially abolished in 1966, yet its spirit never truly vanished. Today, it returns in new clothes, woven not from parchment and papal decrees, but from algorithms and policies called community standards. The digital age has built its own index, one that decides what we see, what we miss, and what quietly disappears from view. In the past, the Church justified censorship by claiming to protect believers from error. Now, platforms argue that they are protecting users from harm, hate, or misinformation. The language has changed, but the logic remains familiar. A powerful gatekeeper decides what is safe and what is toxic, what should be visible and what must be hidden. The decision is rarely transparent, and those affected rarely have a chance to appeal. Just as an author in the 17th century might discover his book suddenly banned, a modern creator may wake up to find a post deranked, a video shadow banned, or an account suspended. The punishment is not fire, but silence. Shadow banning is one of the strangest tools of the new index. Unlike a formal ban, it leaves no obvious mark. A person continues to post, unaware that their words have been buried under layers of invisibility. Followers never see the content, searches refuse to display it, and engagement dwindles to nothing. In effect, the speaker is exiled without ever being told. This mirrors the older tactic of quietly discouraging the reading of forbidden books. Instead of dramatic suppression, the strategy is to let words fade into obscurity, starved of an audience. Deranking works in a similar way. Search engines and feeds push certain results to the margins while promoting others to the top. This hierarchy of visibility is invisible to the user, but decisive in shaping what the public perceives as truth. Centuries ago, Jesuit censors might annotate a book, trimming dangerous lines, or inserting commentary to guide interpretation. Today, platforms reshape knowledge by controlling what rises first on your screen. The order is not random, it is chosen. And in that choice lies the power to define reality. Community standards serve as the modern justification. They are written like secular commandments, vague enough to be flexible, yet strict enough to silence dissent. What qualifies as misinformation in one year may be promoted as fact in the next. What is banned in one country may be celebrated in another. The rules shift, but the control remains constant. Behind the friendly language of community, the same ancient mechanism is at work. To guard the collective, an authority decides what the collective may not read. The new index reminds us that visibility is power. Words do not need to be erased to be destroyed. They only need to be hidden long enough that no one remembers them. Whether by papal decree or by digital policy, the result is the same. Truth becomes what we are allowed to see, and silence becomes the most effective form of censorship. The Jesuits have always been wrapped in paradox. To some, they are holy men who gave their lives to teaching, service, and mission. Saints who walked among the poor and died in distant lands for their faith. To others, they are strategists, power brokers in black robes who bent kings and parliaments with whispered counsel and shaped empires with a quiet hand. How can one order carry both reputations at once? The answer lies in the paradox itself. The Jesuits were both, often in the very same person, saints and strategists, visionaries and schemers, bound together in a single suit of cloth. Take Francis Xavier, one of the earliest companions of Ignatius of Loyola. He travelled to India, Japan, and died on the threshold of China in 1552. To those who met him, he was a figure of devotion, baptizing thousands, caring for lepers, teaching children in villages far from Rome. Yet his mission was also strategic. His presence opened doors for European influence, laying the groundwork for trade and diplomacy. To call him only a saint or only a strategist is to miss the strange duality that defined his role. Another figure, Robert Bellarmine, became a cardinal in the late 16th century. He defended the Church during the Reformation with sharp intellect and steady logic. To some, he was a saintly theologian, later canonized for his writings and devotion. Yet he was also the man who oversaw the trial of Galileo, pressing the astronomer to silence views that contradicted church teaching. To admirers, he upheld faith against chaos. To critics, he stifled science with politics. Both stories are true, and together they show the paradox of Jesuit identity. Even Ignatius himself embodied this tension. A former soldier turned mystic, he wrote the spiritual exercises, guiding countless souls toward God through meditation and discipline. At the same time, he drafted constitutions for an order built on military precision, demanding obedience that rivaled that of any army. His vision gave the world both saints of compassion and masters of control. In him, the paradox was born. Critics through history have struggled with this dual image. Was the Jesuit who knelt in prayer in the morning the same man who advised a king in the afternoon? Could a priest who lived in poverty also pull strings in courts of wealth? To many outsiders, it looked like hypocrisy. To Jesuits themselves, it was unity, the belief that every talent, whether in prayer or politics, could be directed toward the greater glory of God. The Jesuit paradox continues today. Universities bearing their name are praised for excellence, yet accused of elitism. Jesuit priests are celebrated for defending human rights, yet suspected of advancing hidden agendas. Saints and strategists still share the same suit, the same vows, the same disciplined formation. And perhaps that is the secret. The order never sought to be one thing. It sought to be all things, adapting to whatever moment demanded. That flexibility is both their strength and the reason suspicion has always followed them. Saints inspire trust. Strategists provoke fear. The Jesuits chose to be both. An oath can bind tongues, but it cannot bind time. History shows again and again that truth has a way of seeping through cracks no matter how tightly it is sealed. The Jesuits, like many powerful institutions, relied on vows of secrecy to guard their inner workings. Yet, even the most disciplined order could not prevent leaks, whispers, or the quiet rebellion of conscience. What an oath cannot control is the stubborn persistence of memory, the courage of those who speak, and the strange resilience of information itself. In earlier centuries, leaks came in the form of letters and pamphlets. A disillusioned member might copy passages from internal rules or describe the severity of obedience demanded. Enemies of the Jesuits seized on these scraps, amplifying them until they echoed across Europe. The very attempt to keep knowledge hidden gave it an aura of danger, making any fragment feel like revelation. Silence turned rumours into fire. The oath that was meant to prevent exposure instead made every whisper sound like proof. Whistleblowers have always been the nightmare of secretive orders. A priest troubled by conscience could reveal practices he felt crossed the line between devotion and manipulation. Once spoken, such confessions could not be recalled. They entered public debate, fueling suspicion and drawing more eyes to the order's hidden chambers. Whether entirely accurate or distorted by anger, These accounts showed that the oath could not erase the possibility of dissent from within. Human loyalty, no matter how carefully trained, is never absolute. The rise of archives added another weakness. Documents stored behind stone walls may seem secure, but time has a way of loosening locks. Papers forgotten in a library, records misplaced in a provincial house, or manuscripts seized during political upheavals, all provided glimpses of what was meant to remain secret. Each fragment that surfaced allowed scholars to piece together stories once buried. Ironically, the Jesuits' own devotion to recording and preserving knowledge ensured that one day some of it would slip beyond their control. In the modern era, information multiplies faster than it can be suppressed. A leaked file can be copied thousands of times in minutes. Data mirrored across servers becomes impossible to erase. Attempts at censorship often draw more attention, as if silence itself has become suspicious. The power of oaths and secrecy falters in a world where technology favors transparency. The very methods once used to guard control, records, archives, communications, now serve as channels through which truth escapes. What an oath cannot control is the hunger of human beings to know. Each generation produces voices willing to question, scholars eager to search, and rebels bold enough to reveal. The Jesuits, with all their discipline and strategies, could never seal every fissure. For truth, even when bent or buried, has a way of finding the light. And when it does, it reminds us of a lesson more powerful than any vow. Silence can delay knowledge, but it cannot destroy it. Why do we keep hearing about an oath that may never have been spoken? Why does the rumor of secret vows echo across centuries, even when no document can prove it? The answer lies less in history and more in psychology. Secrecy creates its own gravity. When something is hidden, we lean closer. When silence is enforced, we imagine what must fill it. The Jesuit oath, whether real or forged, continues to haunt because it represents the human fear of unseen power, the suspicion that what is whispered in shadows can shape the fate of nations. Secrecy draws attention precisely because it withholds. If the Jesuits had openly published every detail of their formation and rules, perhaps the world would have lost interest. But the combination of strict discipline, closed meetings, and visible influence created the perfect environment for suspicion. People began to hear what was never said. They filled the silence with imagined words, piecing together fragments until an oath seemed inevitable. In this way, the legend became louder than any official denial. The echo replaced the voice. Power magnifies this effect. The Jesuits were never a small hidden cult. They advised kings, educated princes, and directed universities. When such men operate behind closed doors, the secrecy takes on greater weight. It feels less like privacy and more like conspiracy. Ordinary people ask themselves, if this order can bend rulers and shape empires, what must they be promising one another in secret? The oath became a story that explained the inexplicable. It offered a simple answer to a complicated reality. Psychology also teaches us that forbidden knowledge has a special allure. A child told not to open a box will think of little else. Adults are no different. When books were banned or texts locked away, curiosity only grew stronger. The rumoured oath played into this instinct perfectly. It was always just out of reach, described but never seen, denounced but never disproved. That tension made it unforgettable. To deny it was to feed it, to repeat it was to confirm it. Either way, the echo endured. The power of the unheard oath also lies in projection. People project their fears onto what they cannot see. Rivals of the Jesuits feared deception, so they imagined vows of disguise. Rulers feared assassination, so they imagined vows of blood. Protestants feared infiltration, so they imagined vows of absolute loyalty to Rome. Each fear found its reflection in the alleged text. The oath became a mirror, reflecting not the reality of the Jesuits, but the anxieties of those who opposed them. Hearing the unheard reminds us that myths survive not only because of lies, but because of needs. People needed an explanation for the Jesuits' resilience, for their power, for their ability to vanish under suppression and reappear stronger. The oath filled that gap. Even if it never existed, the world still heard it, because silence and secrecy create echoes in the mind. And those echoes, once formed, can ring louder than truth itself. In the end, the question is not simply whether the Jesuit oath was real or forged. The deeper question is why it mattered and why it still matters. Across centuries, the story has been retold in whispers, pamphlets, novels, and now digital debates. Each retelling reveals less about the Jesuits themselves and more about our own relationship to power and secrecy. The oath stands as both symbol and mirror. To confront it honestly, we must practice what the Jesuits themselves once taught: discernment. The final discernment is not blind acceptance or blind rejection, but the courage to examine sources, patterns, and motives until the shadows themselves begin to take shape. The first step is to examine sources. Where do the words come from? Are they born in official archives or hostile propaganda? Are they consistent across languages or full of suspicious changes? In history, as in life, the origin of a story often tells us more than its content. The oath as a text may reveal the hand of its forgers, but the persistence of the myth reveals the fears of those who spread it. Looking closely at sources helps us see how legends are manufactured and how they survive. The second step is to trace patterns. The alleged oath is not the only time secret vows have been rumoured. Similar accusations appeared against Templars in the 14th century, against Freemasons in the 18th, and against political movements in the modern age. Each case follows a familiar pattern. A group operates with discipline and secrecy, its influence grows, and enemies respond with stories of dark rituals. The pattern tells us that myths are not random. They repeat because they fulfill a human need to explain hidden power. The third step is to question motives. Who benefits from spreading the story of the oath? For Protestants in the 19th century, it justified suspicion of Catholics. For politicians, it provided ammunition against rivals. For skeptics today, it serves as proof that institutions always hide more than they admit. By following motives, we learn that myths are rarely harmless. They are tools wielded in battles for influence, identity, and control. Even a lie can shape reality if enough people find it useful. What the oath represents, whether myth or memory, is the danger of unasked questions. Power thrives in silence. When people accept the stories given to them, whether glowing praise or dark suspicion, they surrender the chance to test them. To practice final discernment is to refuse both blind trust and blind fear. It is to recognize that every institution, whether a church, a government, or a platform, must be examined, not once, but always. The final discernment is not about solving the riddle of the oath. It is about keeping alive the habit of questioning. Myths will continue to circulate. Secrets will continue to tempt. Power will continue to guard its archives. But as long as there are those willing to ask, to look again, and to follow the cracks where truth seeps through, silence will never be absolute. In the end, the oath's greatest danger is not whether it was real. Its danger lies in the questions never asked.